This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. New Hampshire voters will head to the polls in under a month, 8 days after the Iowa caucuses. These small states have kicked off presidential election years since the 1970s. But is a state-by-state primary system the best way to narrow the candidate field for the country's highest office? Coming up, we talk with Galen Druk, host and producer of 538's Politics podcast. Galen and his team have launched a fitting podcast series for the next few months called The Primaries Project. We learn more just ahead. First, the latest polls show 4 Democratic candidates are neck and neck in the lead up to New Hampshire's primary, February 11th. So what's happening on the ground there? Joining us from New Hampshire is Josh Rogers, senior political reporter for New Hampshire Public Radio. Josh, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Our listeners can join too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Josh, you've been a politics reporter for some time. So tell us, what is it like to be in New Hampshire before the primary? What's happening there?
Well, it's busy. I was out this weekend, and a lot of candidates were in Iowa, but Michael Bennet, Colorado Senator, and Andrew Yang were here. They pretty much had the state to themselves. And I guess Elizabeth Warren was here for part of the weekend too. But you get the sense that, now that we're a month out, voters are really starting to pay more attention and starting to finalize potentially their decisions. They're, still a bunch of time, and, new people in New Hampshire, don't like to admit this often, but what happens in Iowa will have a huge effect on their final decision making. But some people who have gone and seen dozens of candidates and dozens of events told me yesterday that they're getting closer to making a decision. And, we've got the same clump at the top of the polls here as are in Iowa, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, and Pete Buttigieg. And then there are several candidates a little bit farther down in the polls, Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker, and, Andrew Yang, who also have some support here. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. No one who's sane would pretend to really know what's going to happen in the next month.
So let's talk about those latest polls. So who's leading in New Hampshire, depending on which voter you're talking to?
Well, Bernie Sanders appears to be leading at the moment. I mean, that's what the most recent polls indicate. But, the margins of error are all such that he couldn't actually be leading. And, but he's running strong. He obviously won here in 2016. This was the first state he won in what ended up being a longer Democratic primary process. He got 60% of the vote last time. Most polls now show him at around 20% support. Today, he's being endorsed by the local chapter of the SEIU, which represents more than 10,000 state employees and some other workers. It's one of the more significant union endorsements a candidate can pick up in New Hampshire. That should help him. That same union endorsed him 4 years ago. Elizabeth Warren has run strong in New Hampshire and, like Bernie Sanders, may enjoy some degree of advantage from being in a neighboring state. I mean, obviously, both Sanders and Warren are national political figures, but traditionally, typically, people from neighboring states tend to do well in the primary here. They've always pretty much come in first and second. Joe Biden obviously is universal name recognition and have some support here. And Pete Buttigieg is also somebody whose message is appealing to a lot of voters, including some independent voters. And also, we have a lot of voters in New Hampshire relatively sort of like high income, high educational attainment, and he's appealing to those folks. And so, it is really hard to know where this is going right now. You don't get the sense that a lot of people have made up their mind completely, and it's going to be a busy month.
When we think about some of the New England candidates that you mentioned, like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, what about Deval Patrick? He came into the race fairly late. What do New Hampshire residents think of him?
Well, most people who are close to politics would say they don't understand why he got in as late as he has. I mean, that's the first question he faces. And while he certainly was governor of Massachusetts for 2 terms, he was not somebody who spent a lot of time cultivating the sort of relationships that politicians who hope one day to run for president typically do. It's hard to know. A lot of people are saying, had he gotten the race, 8 months ago, a year ago, I might give him a serious look and find him credible. But, Right now they say they don't. He would say that, he's been underestimated his whole life and he has a path. But, as of last week, he's up with his first campaign ad and was still finalizing, rental space for a campaign office. And, we have candidates with dozens of employees working for more than a year in some cases. And so, I'm not finding too many people who are taking him terribly seriously.
You also reported recently on how New Hampshire voters think of Joe Biden, someone who's been part of the establishment for some time. Not real excited about him, but they see him as somebody that would be a solid leader.
Well, that's what the polling indicates, and that's what my reporting indicates, is that it can be a little jarring, frankly, to talk to somebody who's like, oh, I really like Joe Biden. I think he's a solid guy. I trust him, et cetera. And then all of a sudden veer into, but, I'm here because I wonder whether he's too old and whether he's as sharp as he needs to be. And if he's not as sharp as he needs to be, I'm not going to be voting for him. So, Joe Biden has some big advantages in terms of, obviously, name recognition. It's worth remembering he has actually run in the New Hampshire primary, though in neither case did he actually make it to primary day, like back in the 80s. And then in 2008, neither of those campaigns did he really pick up all that much steam here. Obviously, his reputation was burnished by being vice president. There are a lot of people who think that he's the sanest choice, given that he's well known and you can, on paper, make the case that he builds the strongest coalition, and maybe that will come to pass. But you go to his events, and it's not like they're electrifying, and maybe they don't need to be electrifying. But he has the support of the state firefighters union, which is a big deal in some New Hampshire elections. He has but things could change. And if he comes out of Iowa with a bad result, it'll be interesting to see what happens in New Hampshire. But, he's certainly in the mix to win this thing.
Josh Rogers is speaking with us from New Hampshire. He's senior political reporter for New Hampshire Public Radio, as that state's primary is under a month from now. You can join our conversation. Coming up, we're going to talk about how the primary system for the presidential election came to be with 538's Galen Druk. Our number to join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Josh, I was wondering if you could talk more about just the demographics of New Hampshire. That's gotten a lot of attention this presidential election season. New Hampshire, like Iowa, very predominantly white states, maybe not demographically, or we know not demographically representative of the Democratic Party. And so I'm wondering how residents are feeling about that as that attention has been called this time around.
Well, this is not a new phenomenon. New Hampshire has, it's certainly becoming more ethnically diverse, racially diverse. It's 95% plus white. It's a fairly rich state in terms of if you look at the average income, there's certainly pockets of poverty in New Hampshire, but it's a state that it's a very secular state. It's a very white state. It's a pretty well-educated state. Whether or not it truly represents the demographics of the country has been debated for some years. One thing that's interesting this year is that you actually had that argument coming out of the mouths of candidates, most pointedly former HUD Secretary Julian Castro said that essentially Iowa and New Hampshire shouldn't go first, given that they don't represent the country demographically. And, given the coalition that Democrats are likely to need to build to defeat President Trump, that debate's taken on greater urgency. People here who are deeply invested in keeping the primary here would tell you that, the first four states are a good mix and represent the country. It is what it is. New Hampshire is certainly changing. It's hard to make a case on the merits that New Hampshire is representative of the rest of the country, but institutionally, the people who want to keep the primary here would say that New Hampshire gives candidates that don't have a lot of money a chance, and it also provides the face-to-face campaigning that people here and like to believe is important. Whether or not, if you look back to 2016, whether or not that sort of face-to-face traditional retail-style campaigning necessarily meant much in New Hampshire. You look at Bernie Sanders won and Donald Trump won, both fueled by these, kind of mega rallies. it's interesting, whether or not the model and what we've been taught and what New Hampshire likes to propagate in terms of what is essential, what are essential components of presidential campaigning, whether those are as relevant as they used to be. But the facts are the facts on the demographics, and it'll be interesting to see moving forward what the implications of that are. I mean, it's been 4 cycles since there was really much of a challenge to New Hampshire's role in the lineup, and that was resolved by creating the sort of 4 early states being Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada.
Speaking of demographics in New Hampshire, you have a whole bunch of new voters this time around. Who are they leaning towards, Josh?
Well, that's an interesting question, and certainly one the campaigns. I mean, one thing that is interesting about New Hampshire, and this is not a totally new phenomenon, it's been going on for several election cycles, is that apparently New Hampshire is the 6th most churning state demographically. We've got a lot of candidates. We've got a lot of people moving in. We've got some people aging out. And, New Hampshire has a very, very small percentage of its population who is actually native born, which does make sense given that the state is small and that, our economy really feeds off of that of Massachusetts. So there's lots of immigration from Massachusetts traditionally, but there are people moving here from all over the place. And we have older people retiring to some communities in the northern part of the state that are making some small towns a bit more liberal than they used to be. And, it'll be interesting to see. We've been looking in our newsroom where campaigns are choosing to send their candidates, and it's a bit more complicated this cycle because there have been 20 plus candidates running at various points in this race. You're going to get people sent to places where they normally might not fight for votes, such as, Upper Carroll County, some of the small towns up north. I mean, most of the population is south of Concord, clustered along the Massachusetts border, Hillsborough and Rockingham counties. Those areas, the Massachusetts border is really where Republicans tend to rack up votes historically. You have a lot of kind of born-again New Hampshire people who kind of move here to avoid some of the broad-based taxes of Massachusetts. The campaigns are fighting for every vote they can, and it'll be interesting to see. The young people are definitely polling indicate that they're strongest with Bernie. And then we have, the Democratic primary. A lot of the older voters are actually drawn to Pete Buttigieg. So you have this kind of inversion of the old guy drawing the young support and the youngest guy drawing the sort of the older support. A lot of older voters I talk to, for them, Pete Buttigieg is kind of like, in some ways an old person's idea of a young person. So this is going to be interesting to watch.
I'm not sure he would embrace that.
No,
but
I don't
okay.
think he would like that, but I think it's true.
Well, I want to thank Josh Rogers for joining us, senior political reporter for New Hampshire Public Radio. A busy month for you ahead, Josh. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Up next, when did American voters get the chance to select which presidential candidate was nominated by the National Party? You might be surprised by the answer. We talk with 538's Galen Druk about that question after the break. You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Primary season is almost here. Iowa starts things off with its caucuses February 3rd, followed by primaries in New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina before a Super Tuesday. But Connecticut's primary isn't until the end of April. Ironically, it was a group of Connecticut activists in 1968 that helped launch a reform movement to change how parties nominated presidential candidates. 538's latest podcast series gets into that history. It's called The Primaries Project. Host and producer of 538's Politics podcast, Galen Druk, joins me now with more. Galen, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we were just talking with New Hampshire Public Radio about its primary. And again, a lot of attention in the start with Iowa and New Hampshire, these small states that have these early caucuses and primaries. But it's interesting when we think about this system, it's not that many decades old. Tell us how the primary system came to be in the presidential race, I guess beginning in 1968.
Yeah, so the system that we take for granted today only really began in the 70s, and it was the result of a raucous, essentially disastrous Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, the Democratic Party was very divided over the war in Vietnam and also divided over the civil rights movement. And essentially, you had a situation where there was an anti-war camp within the Democratic Party and a more establishment camp that was backing Hubert Humphrey, the vice president at the time, who supported the war. And you got a bunch of activists who were upset that even if they had support in states like Connecticut, they wouldn't necessarily be able to get delegates to the national convention. Because back then, there wasn't a one-for-one relationship between getting support in a primary and then getting delegates to go to the national convention. In fact, there were only about a dozen primaries back then. So in large part, the Democratic Party was using caucuses, and it was still kind of that machine era of politics where party insiders would choose delegates to go to the convention and wheel and deal on the convention floor. And kind of that whole model got blown up after 1968 because of how contentious that convention was and how upset anti-war activists were about not having a bigger say in the party.
So I was surprised listening to your first episode of the Primaries podcast about Connecticut's role in introducing this idea of proportional delegates. You interviewed Ben Goodman, who wrote about the changes to the nominating process. Here's a clip.
What a group of activists in Connecticut came together and did not only changed the way that we elect presidents, but changed how our national parties work and changed how our presidents govern and run the national parties when they're in office.
So, Galen, tell us more. What did these reformers do?
So essentially, you had the anti-war activists backing Senator Eugene McCarthy. And of course, you had the establishment backing Humphrey, who wasn't even really running in the primaries because he had establishment support, so he didn't have to. Now, the anti-war activists who were backing Eugene McCarthy in Connecticut thought, if we can get a bunch of delegates to the state convention, then we should be able to make the argument that the number of delegates who then go on to the national Democratic convention should be in proportion to the number of delegates that we got to the state convention there in Connecticut. That was just not the way that things were done then. And so those Connecticut activists weren't granted their delegates proportionally. They basically walked out of the state convention and started a counter convention across the way. And they didn't only do that. They started a kind of commission that would argue for changing the rules of the Democratic Party more broadly to require something of a proportional system, not exactly proportional. What the wording was more like, the delegates to the national convention have to fairly reflect the preferences of voters in that state. And so after the Connecticut convention, they got other anti-war activists and McCarthy supporters from around the country on board to rewrite these rules, took those rules to the national convention in Chicago. And even after Humphrey was actually awarded the nomination, which was a significant loss for the anti-war part of the Democratic Party, they got these rules changes through the convention floor. The delegates actually passed them. It's debated today whether or not the delegates to the national convention actually understood the rules that they were even passing at the time. But it really amounted to, again, an overhaul of the way that the Democratic Party chose its nominees, and then eventually the Republican Party followed suit.
So this really changed how we saw primaries. It became more important. But when we think about how they are ordered today, how did Iowa and New Hampshire become some of these early important primaries, Galen?
It's basically an accident. Before the system changed in 1968 or post 1968, leading into 72 and then 76, the order really didn't matter because it wasn't a public process. And the delegates who were chosen at caucuses or through primaries were not necessarily required to vote for any one person on the convention floor. In fact, a lot of times the delegates were chosen before candidates for the presidency had even announced. And so there was no point in the media kind of following contest by contest to see who was up or who was down over the course of primaries and caucuses, because it was the convention that actually mattered. But after the rules changed, particularly heading into 1972, then you could kind of tally state by state who was up and who was down, because the delegates to the national convention had to fairly reflect, again, the voters' preferences in those states. Now, the reason that Iowa ended up first is because after the rules changes, they said, your contest has to be within the year of the election. So previously they were having caucuses, more than a year in advance of the convention, of the national convention. And Iowa has a complicated process. So in order to follow that new rule where it would happen within the year of the election, they had to go pretty early on. And so initially it didn't seem like that would necessarily matter all that much. But what Jimmy Carter figured out in 1976 is that if you camp out in Iowa and you do well in Iowa, then all of the media attention that comes with winning an early state, Iowa, will help propel you to do well in future contests. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, nobody really knew who Jimmy Carter was. He was the governor of Georgia at the time, but he was a non-entity in national Democratic politics. And then all of a sudden, he does well in Iowa and goes on to win the Democratic nomination, although Democratic Party insiders basically, had no relationship with him whatsoever. And, New Hampshire is similar. Again, it was one of the early states to actually adopt primaries. Now we think of primaries as ubiquitous, but back in the 60s, again, only a dozen states had primaries. And so because New Hampshire was kind of a trailblazer in this, it was already going early. And then once it became clear how much power was associated with being an early state, the kind of party establishment within those states, both amongst Republicans and Democrats, have fought pretty hard to maintain that powerful status of being an early state.
You're hearing Galen Druk, host and producer of 538's Politics podcast. They have a new series out over the next few months looking at how the primaries system came to be in our country. You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Galen, as we heard from New Hampshire Public Radio's Josh Rogers, a lot of attention this cycle after Julian Castro questioned the idea that Iowa goes first, especially when you look at how diverse the Democratic Party is today. So what are some of the unintended consequences of this system that we have now?
Absolutely. So the first unintended consequence is that it privileges voters in early states. That was not the intention. When the rules were rewritten, it was not with the understanding that a certain set of states would go first that would have a great impact on how the rest of the states would end up voting. So that's obviously an unintended consequence, and it's become an even more significant unintended consequence as the Democratic Party has grown increasingly diverse, but states like Iowa and New Hampshire are really not diverse at all. If you want an example of the kind of state that actually reflects the Democratic Party, Illinois is actually the most kind of representative of the Democratic Party's demographics. When it comes to the Republican Party, Iowa is pretty representative of the Republican Party's demographics. It's quite white anyway. But then when you look at New Hampshire with regards to religious affiliation and things like that, New Hampshire is not particularly representative of the Republican Party either. So you now have a situation where neither parties are super well represented by the early states. And it's important to note that even though Nevada and South Carolina go this year third and fourth, they have a significantly reduced impact on, how the rest of the states vote. Iowa is really kind of the major factor in giving candidates a bounce early on. There are plenty of other unintended consequences. One, for example, is that there's no longer any ability really for delegates to wheel and deal on the convention floor and come to some kind of compromise. If there's a contested convention, it could happen, but there hasn't been a contested convention since these rules changes. And so what you end up having sometimes is a pretty fractured party that can be divided over candidates and not have any clear way of making a decision or coming to a compromise. For example, and this is a bigger issue when you have a lot of people running in the race, like in 2016. Donald Trump early on had about 30% support, with 70% of Republican voters not interested in Donald Trump being the nominee. But the rest of the Republican voters were fractured amongst the different candidates. And so in this system, it's easier to win as a factional candidate and kind of usurp the rest of the party and go on to win. And in the old system, factional candidates were less frequent just because the whole party had to come to a consensus on the convention floor.
If we think about reordering primaries to be similar to a state's Democratic electorate as to the party's nationwide voter base, also criticisms that may keep predominant African American states who are also part of a key voting bloc in the Democratic Party from having a say early on in the process, Galen?
It's true that, for example, South Carolina, which has a large number of African-American Democratic voters, is also not particularly representative of the Democratic Party, right? And so it's kind of interesting that the Democratic Party does it in such a way where instead of having, 3 or 4 states that are representative of the party go first, which are states like Illinois or New Jersey, which are quite mixed states, it has a bunch of states that are not so representative of the party overall. Nevada, interestingly, is in the top 5 of most representative states of the Democratic Party. So if you do want a good sense of kind of what the Democratic Party wants, given its mix of demographics, maybe look more to Nevada than to Iowa or New Hampshire. There's also an argument that we do, one national primary day where everybody votes on the same day. And that comes with its own complications. And of course, small states like New Hampshire and Iowa have their arguments for why they think retail campaigning in a small state is important early on. But I mean, the reality is there are lots of different ideas out there for how we could do this differently. They all come with their own complications and difficulties.
I think another approach that has been discussed by some poli-sci political scientists is looking at grouping states to produce these representative electorates across state lines. Would that be something that would maybe have a chance in moving forward, Galen?
It's difficult to know. So this is an interesting area of our democracy because it's not in the Constitution. Parties are not in the Constitution, and how parties select their kind of candidates to run in general elections is not in the Constitution. This has traditionally been up to parties, and then parties have kind of written these rules a little bit more into stone through state law. But it's at the end of the day, parties are private organizations and they can structure this how they want. And so if activists within either party wanted to change the system, they could. But, inertia is a powerful force in politics, and politicians and party activists are oftentimes small c conservative in the sense that they've been doing something this way for so long that it becomes difficult to kind of change things. Usually, these kinds of systems are changed as a result of failure. 1968 was a big failure for the Democratic Party, which is when they chose to rewrite their rules. So perhaps if either party comes to the conclusion that the nominating system as it stands is disadvantaging them in the sense that they can't find candidates that can go on to win general elections, or that they can't find candidates who are good at governing once they win those elections, then they could be open to changing the rules. And again, wouldn't take any kind of constitutional amendment. Really, it would be up to the parties and then to the state parties to enact any changes. You mentioned kind of grouping states. It's called a regional rotating primary. That's another possibility that appeases people who say if we have one national primary day, it would put so much of an emphasis on national name recognition and money that, smaller candidates who may have good governing experience may not be able to break through. And so that's a possibility. One reason that people argue it should be rotating is so that it's not the same state every year. And you perhaps wouldn't every 4 years, and you would not perhaps even make it clear to candidates which state it would be until the first of the year or something like that, so that candidates only have, a few months to campaign in those states before they start voting. Whereas now you have people heading to Iowa basically the day that the last president is elected to start their campaigns in an unofficial way.
I mentioned this first episode of the Primaries podcast. What are some other questions that you hope to answer in the next few months, Galen?
So we're looking essentially at how did the system get to be the way that it is today? And it's essentially the answer to that is it's an accident. The Democratic Party, even when it rewrote the rules, it didn't intend for the system to play out the way it has. The next question we're asking is, what are the consequences of the system? There have been plenty of unintended consequences. And it's something that I think people have taken more of a look at in the wake of President Trump's victory within the Republican primary. It's hard to remember now, but there was no party support for Donald Trump when he first got in the race. And it wasn't until months after he started winning primary elections that he even got his first congressional endorsement. So we have a system where an outsider can really kind of take over the whole party from the outside. There are other unintended consequences as well. And then lastly, we're looking at how things could be different. So throughout the project, we talked to a lot of academics, political scientists, authors, researchers, and asked them, if you could do things differently, how would you structure the system? And there are a lot of ideas out there. Some of them we discussed. A common theme actually was give the party more control. Essentially, I think that, a lot of people would not be happy with this, especially, given the feeling that it would make the process, a lot of people have the feeling that it would make the process less democratic. But it's important to remember in all of this that the United States is the only country in the world, basically, democracy in the world that does things the way that we do them. In most other countries, democracies that we think of as highly functional, democracies that we look up to, like Scandinavian democracies or Australia, et cetera, New Zealand, have systems where the parties have a lot more control. Basically, it's up to the parties who they want to nominate and put forth in a general election, and then the voters get to decide in a general election. And the argument for that is that parties are supposed to mean something. They're supposed to have a policy platform that is above candidate personality and things like that. Whereas in our system, we really do emphasize, how well somebody does in front of the media cameras and that kind of thing.
Well, thanks for the breakdown. Galen Druk, host and producer of 538's Politics Podcast, their latest series, The Primaries Project. Galen, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to shift focus to a high-profile murder case in Connecticut that's prompted advocates against domestic violence to call for new laws. More after the break, and you can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This programming note starting tonight, Where We Live's evening repeat will air at 8 p.m. And you can also listen to our episodes on your favorite podcast app. Also coming up tomorrow, 1 in 4 undergraduates are raising children. Are you one of these so-called non-traditional students? On the next Where We Live, we talk to student parents about the challenges of juggling college and kids. And how can policymakers and college officials better meet the needs of this student population? We want to hear from you. That show tomorrow. Now we're shifting focus to a high-profile murder case that's now drawing attention to Connecticut's family court system. Last week, Fotis Doulos was arrested and charged with murder in connection to the disappearance of his estranged wife, Jennifer Farber-Doulos. She disappeared in the middle of divorce and child custody court proceedings that had been going on for 2 years. Now, a state lawmaker has proposed legislation to keep victims of domestic violence and their children safe during these custody cases. I want to welcome to the show by phone State Senator Alex Bergstein, who represents Greenwich, New Canaan, and Stamford. Senator Bergstein, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
So tell us about your Child Safety First bill. I believe it does call for changes to the family court system and the process. Tell us why you're honing in on that.
Yes, well, this is just the first in a series of proposals that I will be making to address the issue of domestic violence and abuse that is pervasive. It happens in every community, in every state, regardless of zip code. So what we have found and what the research shows is that there is actually an institutionalized bias against women in family courts. When there was a major study published this past summer by Joan Meyer, who's a law professor at George Washington University, she analyzed over 4,000 custody cases, which showed that when there is abuse in a family, and even when there's child sexual abuse, the abuser is 3 times more likely to gain custody. So based on that shocking but empirical evidence, we now know that we have a serious problem to address. So what my bill does is it elevates abuse and violence to be the first issue that courts have to address before looking at any other factor in the best interest of the child.
Is this modeled after other legislation in other states or even federally?
Yes, in fact, the House in 2018, September 2018, passed a non-binding resolution. It's called House Congressional Resolution 72, which had support from Republicans and Democrats that advised all states to do exactly this, to elevate child safety and issues of abuse and violence to be the first issue addressed in custody cases. So that's exactly what the first part of my bill does. It also expands the definition of domestic violence abuse because we know that it's much more than physical violence. It can include all sorts of coercive, controlling behaviors, including litigation abuse, which appears to be exactly what happened in the Doulos case. Any case that has more than 100 motions is really not about conflict between two parties. It's really more about abuse by one party.
I wanted to bring another perspective into this conversation. Karen Jarmock joins us by phone, President and CEO of Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Karen, welcome back to Where We Live.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Could you tell me, listening to State Senator Bergstein's proposal to change how family court proceedings move forward related to the safety of victims and their families, what is your response to some of her proposals?
I think her proposals are right on. I mean, we have viewed a challenge around the experience of victims of domestic violence in the family court setting for quite some time, and this is not an issue that is simply beholden to Connecticut. This is an ongoing challenge. And there have been various strategies that have been employed over the years to try to address this issue. In particular, the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence is also introducing legislation in response to a convening that took place over the summer that Senator Bergstein was involved in with Senator Flexer and Winfield. And in particular, this idea that in many states there is the existence of something called a bench book to serve as a guidance to judges, in particular around various complicated cases. We are proposing a statutory measure to create a task force so that it is transparent and the voices of survivors and advocates are included in the development of this bench book, which would include the identification of a descriptor around litigation abuse and a statutory measure, and that the judges in Connecticut would need to utilize this bench book and be trained specifically on this bench book because we know that these are complex cases. And I read in the Associated Press a comment by Judge Albus, who leads in the family court in the state of Connecticut yesterday around the extent of training that judges get. But if we are still seeing these challenges, then we need to do more and we need to do better.
When we think about domestic violence victims who may have the custody process used against them by their abusers, can you walk us through some of what they're experiencing, Karen?
Well, we know that abusive partners often use the family court as their next mechanism. I mean, sometimes people have this understanding when someone is going through a divorce or has left their partner and there are child custody matters that then the abuse starts. And quite honestly, it just translates itself into the family court where the abusive partner uses the court to threaten, to harass, and to stalk their former partner. And we know that judges need to be doing more to prevent that from happening.
State Senator Alex Bergstein, again, is also with us by phone. What is your response to Karen Jarmock's proposal that more training needs to happen within the court system so judges understand the many facets of domestic violence?
Yeah, I agree that judicial training has to be one component, and we have to be very careful about who is doing that training and what they are training them to look for and to do. So, we can't let the fox into the hen house, so to speak. But there's much more that we should be doing, and one other facet of this is protective orders, restraining orders. The legal bar to get a restraining order in Connecticut is much higher than it is in other states. Essentially, a woman has to prove that she's been physically abused. And as we said before, there are many other forms of abuse, including threats, intimidation, threats to take away the children or to harm the children. And all of those qualify for a restraining order in other states, but apparently not in Connecticut. We also know that in Connecticut, many women who are being abused do not have legal representation. And when they do have legal representation, because a pilot program called the Gideon Project was done, their chances, just by having somebody, a lawyer, help them fill out the paperwork, their chances of getting a protective order, even when the facts are the same, increases by 50%. So I think that every victim is entitled to legal representation, and we need to provide that in order to protect women and children.
Karen Jarmock, again, President and CEO of Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Can you add to that? That is surprising that you hear from what Senator Bergstein is saying, that so many of these domestic violence victims don't have representation.
Sure, and just to clarify around restraining orders, so the bar for a restraining order in the state of Connecticut is either the existence of physical violence or the threat of physical violence. But I do agree with Senator Bergstein that any opportunity we have to strengthen the occasion for victims to obtain that order is a good one. In terms of the Civil Gideon Project, that had actually some success this past fiscal year. The judicial branch put out a really subpar report on that project, and it's really deflated what Senator Bergstein was saying. And I'm so glad that she's pointing out the factors that statistically from research we do know that. My understanding is that when someone has a lawyer represent them at a hearing, their chances of obtaining that order increase by 80%. Through the Victims of Crime Act, there are advocates in the civil courts funded through to be there to help with the restraining order process, but these are not attorneys. And so to the extent that there can be that form of representation, that could be very powerful.
Karen, what are we seeing in the state of Connecticut when we look at domestic violence cases, when we look at, unfortunately, intimate violence, homicides? Are the numbers getting worse?
Well, what's been really frustrating this year is that Jennifer Dulos is the 14th confirmed domestic violence homicide in the state of Connecticut for 2019. We are a state that averages 12 to 14. There's a tremendous amount of resources that are offered within various systems to make things better so that we don't have these forms of statistics. And our organization, even though we do fatality review, domestic violence fatality review as a practice here and report out every other year on this, is going to be looking at these most recent numbers because in the year previous that was 9. And it's not just about domestic violence homicide. We know that domestic violence shelters function at 121% capacity statewide all the time. That's a really challenging number. We know that there is just simply not enough resources, especially when Senator Bergstein was highlighting this factor around children. Each of the domestic violence 18 sites are funded less than $12,000 a year to support children in these really difficult circumstances, children who have experienced trauma. And so we'll be looking to see what we can do to strengthen that as well.
Senator Bergstein, to that point about these domestic violence shelters, obviously there's great demand but not enough resources. Is that something that the legislature could take up this session?
Absolutely. We should be looking at that. But I just want to mention that, looking at the number of fatalities that's looking at the tip of the iceberg. I mean, nobody should ever lose their life. That when there were red flags, when they have told the court, I am in danger, and there was every indication given that we needed to protect them. But there are also thousands and thousands of women and children who are living in abusive relationships, many of whom do not even have the resources or the support to leave. So, we have to recognize that it takes really a form of superhuman strength for an abused woman to leave that relationship, because the whole dynamic of an abusive relationship is one where she is being intimidated, dominated into submission, and all these various behaviors like controlling her access to money, isolating her from other people so that she does not have support and does not have agency to actually leave, threatening to take her children away, threatening to harm her children. So when we also have to address the issue of all the women who are in those situations and how do we help them get out safely.
It's a real tragedy what happened to Jennifer Farber-Dulos, but there's also the flip side that there are many women who come from many different socioeconomic backgrounds that are also victims of domestic violence, but attention isn't always paid to them. How do we change that, Senator Bergstein?
Well, that's exactly why I'm talking about it in global terms. This is not just about justice for Jennifer. This is about justice for the thousands of women and children who have been killed by their abusers, but also for the many, many thousands more who are still living with abusers because they don't have either the resources or the support to get out. And even when they do summon that superhuman strength to leave, they often find that the courts do not believe them and in fact penalize them for telling their truth. So we need to really shine a light on this issue, and there are many other ways that we can help women in every economic situation, including what Karen just identified: more support for actual services and shelters, but really taking a close, hard look at the legal system and rooting out bias against women.
I'm Karen Jarmock, President and CEO of Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We have under a minute. Did you want to add to that point?
Yeah, sure. So Senator Bergstein again highlights the circumstance where we know in Connecticut, for example, there's nearly 40,000 victims, adults and children, who seek help from domestic violence organizations in Connecticut, but they are also reaching out through various systems. So the question is, how do we strengthen all of our systems, whether it's in healthcare and law enforcement, the legal system, and other areas that we know that families, especially women who are victims of domestic violence, are struggling to get out of some very, very precarious situations.
Well, I want to thank again Karen Jarmock for joining us, and State Senator Alex Bergstein, who represents Greenwich, New Canaan, and Stamford. Please keep us posted on your legislation as it moves forward.
I will. Thanks so much.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. Learn more about the show. Just download Where We Live on your favorite podcast app. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.